What are signs of an emotionally unintelligent person? Story 1. The wall behind his eyes. My name is Daniel, and the man I want to tell you about is my coworker of 3 years, Marcus. We shared a desk pod at a logistics company, close enough that I watched his daily life unfold in real time. His phone calls, his lunch breaks, his little collisions with the rest of the world. The first time I noticed something was off was over a stolen stapler. Not a big deal on its own, except Marcus had taken it from the intern's desk without asking, and when she asked for it back, mildly annoyed, he shrugged and said, "It's a dollar stapler, why are you being so dramatic?" I remember thinking, that's not really the point, is it? The point was that he'd taken something without asking, and dismissed her feelings about it as an overreaction. He genuinely could not see that the issue wasn't the stapler's value. It was the disrespect of taking it in the first place. That became a pattern. Marcus was chronically late to meetings, sometimes by 15 or 20 minutes, and when people mentioned it, he'd say, "It's fine, I got here eventually." He never seemed to grasp that lateness wasn't just about the clock. It was about telling 5 other people that their time mattered less than his morning coffee run. I tried once to explain it to him in those terms. I said, "Imagine if I made you wait 20 minutes every single day. How would that feel?" He blinked at me like I'd asked him to solve a physics equation. "But you don't," he said, "so it doesn't matter." He couldn't make the leap from his own situation to someone else's. He could only process what was directly in front of him. What struck me most was how flat his understanding of consequences was. He'd borrow money from a mutual friend and forget to pay it back, not out of malice, but because the moment the transaction was out of his hands, it stopped existing for him. He never thought, what does the person on the other end feel when they lend money and never see it again? That thought simply didn't occur to him. There was no cruelty in it. Cruelty would have at least implied he understood he was causing harm. This was something quieter and, in a way, sadder. An absence. Like a room in his mind that had never been furnished. I tried a few more times over the years. When his girlfriend at the time broke up with him, he came to my desk baffled, listing out everything he did for her. Paid for dinners, drove her around, remembered her birthday. As if love were a ledger that should always balance in his favor. "I don't get what more she wanted," he said. I asked him gently if he'd ever asked her how she felt during arguments, if he'd ever sat with her sadness instead of trying to fix it or explain it away. He looked at me blankly. Why would I need to know how she felt if I already knew what I did for her? That sentence stuck with me for a long time. Looking back, I don't think Marcus was a bad person. I think he simply never developed the muscle that lets you climb out of your own head and stand, however briefly, in someone else's shoes. Everything that happened to him was primary and immediate. Everything that happened to other people was abstract, secondary, almost theoretical. He wasn't malicious. He was just permanently stuck at the surface of things, unable to ask the follow-up question. And how does this look from where they're standing? I still think about that stapler sometimes, not because it mattered, but because of how much it revealed. Next up, what happens when every attempt at a calm, ordinary conversation turns into a battlefield? As told by someone who lived through it every single evening. Story 2. The dishes that became a war. I'm Priya, and for 4 years I was married to a man named Colin. On paper, things looked fine. We had a nice apartment, decent jobs, friends who liked us as a couple. But underneath that surface was something I only fully understood once I was far enough away from it to see it clearly. Colin could not tell the difference between being disagreed with and being attacked. It started small, the way these things always do. Early in our marriage, I mentioned, as gently as I knew how, that the dishes had been piling up in the sink for 3 days. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I just wanted to talk about splitting the chore more evenly. Before I even finished my sentence, his face changed, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, and he said, "So what, you think I'm lazy? You think I don't care about this house?" I hadn't said either of those things. I hadn't even implied them. But in his mind, the dishes are piling up, and "You are a terrible, uncaring person" were the same sentence. At first, I thought maybe I was bad at delivering feedback, so I got more careful. I softened my language, chose my moments, used phrases like, "I was thinking maybe we could," instead of, "You need to." It didn't matter. The topic itself was the trigger, not my tone. If I brought up money, he heard, "You think I'm irresponsible." If I brought up his relationship with my mother, he heard, "You think I'm a bad partner." If I brought up something as mundane as forgetting to lock the front door, he heard, "You think I'm careless and stupid." Every single issue, no matter how small, got translated in his head into a verdict on his entire character. The truly exhausting part was that these conversations, which should have taken 5 minutes, would spiral into an hour of him defending himself against accusations I never made. I'd have to stop talking about the actual dishes and instead reassure him, I don't think you're lazy. I don't think you're a bad husband. I just want help with the sink. Only after that reassurance would he calm down enough to actually hear the original, simple request. It was like every conversation had to pass through a security checkpoint of his insecurity before any real information could get through. I remember one night especially clearly. I'd asked calmly whether we could talk about visiting my parents more often. He stood up from the couch and said, almost shouting, "Why do you always have to make me feel like garbage?" I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't criticized him. I had asked a question about a holiday visit, but somewhere between my mouth and his ears, "Can we visit my parents?" had transformed into an indictment. Therapy, which he eventually agreed to attend with me, helped me see the pattern for what it was. Colin couldn't separate the message from the messenger or the issue from his identity. Any critique, however mild, felt to him like a threat to his entire sense of self, so his nervous system reacted as if he were being attacked, not simply spoken to. It wasn't about me being too harsh. It was that there was no version of honest feedback gentle enough to get past that defense. We divorced eventually, not out of hatred, but out of exhaustion. I couldn't spend the rest of my life negotiating a peace treaty every time I wanted to talk about the dishes. Coming next, a story about someone who never, not once, could say the words, "That was my fault." Story 3. The weather was always to blame. My name is Tobias, and for 2 years I lived with a roommate named Felix in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the train station. Living with someone teaches you things about them that a casual friendship never could. And what I learned about Felix was this. In his world, nothing was ever, under any circumstances, his fault. It began with rent. One month, Felix paid late, and the landlord charged us both a fee. When I asked what happened, he said, "The bank's app was glitching." Fair enough, I thought. Technology fails sometimes. But then it happened again the next month. This time it was because work scheduled me for a weird shift and I forgot what day it was. The month after that, it was because you didn't remind me. Even though reminding him of rent had never once been part of our arrangement. There was always a reason, always external, always convenient. Never once did he simply say, "I forgot. I'll be more careful." It wasn't limited to money. He'd leave dishes in the sink for a week, and when I brought it up, explained that he'd been too stressed from work to deal with them, as though stress was a force of nature that operated on everyone except me, who was somehow always able to wash my own dishes despite my own stress. He missed his sister's birthday dinner and blamed traffic, then blamed his phone dying, then blamed his sister for not reminding him enough, all in the same conversation, without seeming to notice the contradictions piling up. What amazed me most was watching him navigate actual conflict at his job. He got written up once for missing a deadline, and over dinner that night he gave me a 20-minute monologue about how his manager had set him up to fail, how the client's specifications were unreasonable, how a coworker had sabotaged the file by not sending him information fast enough. I asked carefully whether any part of the delay might have come from him starting the project late. He looked at me like I'd suggested something absurd. How is that on me? I had 6 other things going on. As if having other responsibilities absolved a person from managing any of them. Living with someone like this is uniquely draining because you start to realize that every conversation about a problem becomes, secretly, a debate about whether the problem exists at all, or rather, whose problem it is. You can never simply solve things together, because solving things together requires 2 people willing to say, "I contributed to this." With Felix, there was only ever one person contributing to anything. Everybody else. The landlord was unreasonable. The bank was glitchy. His manager was unfair. His sister didn't remind him enough. His coworker was slow. I was, on more than one occasion, apparently also too sensitive for pointing any of this out. By the time I moved out, I wasn't angry so much as tired. The specific tiredness that comes from carrying the emotional weight of 2 people's mistakes while only one of you is doing the reflecting. I've thought about it since. And I don't believe Felix was consciously dishonest. I think, in his mind, admitting fault felt less like humility and more like danger, so his brain simply never went there. Whatever cracked, whoever it hurt, there was always, somewhere out there, a reason that wasn't him. Next, A brother who could never quite follow you into what if, and what that revealed every time you tried. Story 4. The Bridge. He couldn't cross. I'm Naomi, and the person in this story is my younger brother, Elliot. We grew up in the same house, went to the same schools, and yet somewhere along the way, our minds developed in very different directions. Mine curious about possibility, his anchored firmly to whatever was directly in front of him. I first noticed it clearly during a family dinner when I was in college. I'd just finished a philosophy class and, feeling talkative, posed a simple hypothetical to the table. If you found a wallet on the street with $500 in it and no ID inside, what would you do? It was meant to spark conversation, the kind of harmless thought experiment people enjoy arguing about over dessert. Elliot frowned at me and said, "That's never happened to me, so I don't know." I tried again, rephrasing it as gently as I could. "I know it hasn't happened, that's the point. It's hypothetical, just imagine it." He shook his head, visibly irritated now. Why would I imagine something that isn't real? That's weird. The conversation moved on, but I remember feeling a strange kind of loneliness, like I'd tried to hand him something and his hands simply weren't shaped to hold it. It happened again years later, when I was helping him think through a job decision. I asked, "What if you took the new position and it didn't work out in 6 months? What's your backup plan?" Instead of engaging with the question, he got defensive, as if I'd accused him of something. "Why are you already assuming I'll fail?" he snapped. I hadn't assumed anything. I was trying to help him plan for a possibility, the way you'd check the weather before a trip without expecting rain. But for Elliot, raising the possibility of failure wasn't a planning exercise. It felt like a verdict, an insult, a prediction of doom aimed directly at him. What became clear over time was that Elliot could only really process what had actually happened, or what was happening right now. Anything conditional, anything requiring him to hold two realities in his mind at once, the actual and the possible, seemed to short-circuit something in him. Where I saw a web of dots that could be connected in different directions depending on the question, Elliot seemed to see only the single dot he was currently standing on. And when I tried to point out the other dots, he didn't experience it as an invitation to think further. He experienced it as an attack, because if he couldn't picture the hypothetical, the only thing left for him to react to was my tone, my intention, my supposed judgment of him. I remember trying one last time, a few years ago, over something as small as vacation planning. What if it rains the day we go hiking? Should we have a backup activity? His response wasn't a plan. It was, "Why do you always expect the worst?" I gave up trying to think out loud with him after that. I love my brother, and I don't think there's anything cruel in him. But I've come to understand that some people navigate the world using only the ground beneath their feet, never the map of where that ground could lead. For Elliot, what if isn't a bridge to somewhere new. It's just an empty space he doesn't know how to cross, so instead he assumes there's something threatening on the other side. Next, a friend whose reaction to the gentlest request was always, somehow, to turn herself into the victim of the conversation. Story 5. The Favor That Became a Crime. My name is Renata, and the woman in this story, Bianca, was one of my closest friends for the better part of a decade. We met in college, stayed close through our 20s, and it was only in our 30s that I began to notice a pattern so consistent it eventually ended the friendship altogether. Any small request I made of Bianca had a strange way of transforming, almost instantly, into an accusation against me. The first time it really struck me, we were splitting the cost of a group gift for a mutual friend's wedding. I texted her as neutrally as I could manage, "Hey, could you send your half whenever you get a chance? No rush." Her reply came fast and sharp. "Wow, okay, I didn't realize I was such a burden to you. Sorry for being poor." I stared at my phone, genuinely confused. I hadn't mentioned money troubles, hadn't implied she was slow, hadn't used any tone at all beyond polite and casual. But somehow, in her mind, a simple reminder had become an insult about her character and her finances. It happened at dinner one night, too. I asked gently if she could keep her voice down a little because the restaurant was quiet and people at nearby tables were glancing over. She didn't lower her voice. She raised it. "Don't tell me how to talk. God, don't yell at me." I hadn't yelled. I had barely raised my eyebrows. But within seconds, she had recast herself as the victim of my aggression, loud enough now that actually everyone was looking, and I found myself apologizing. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because it felt like the only way to make the scene stop. That became the shape of our whole friendship eventually. Any request, no matter how mild, "Could you text me when you land?" Could you not borrow my clothes without asking? Could we maybe not talk about my ex around me? Got answered not with a yes or a no, but with a flinch and a counterattack. Why are you always so controlling? I can't believe you're attacking me right now. I guess I'm just a bad friend to you. Within minutes, I would find myself comforting her, telling her she wasn't a bad friend, that I wasn't attacking her, that I loved her, all in response to a request as small as asking her to text me when she landed safely. Looking back, I recognize the shape of it now, even if I didn't have language for it at the time. Bianca had an almost reflexive way of flipping the emotional roles the second she felt even a flicker of discomfort. The moment I asked for something, she stopped being the person being asked and became, instantly, the person being wronged. And I stopped being the person asking and became, instantly, the aggressor who needed to apologize. It didn't matter how calm my voice was or how reasonable my request was. The transformation happened regardless. Like a switch she couldn't help flipping. What made it so hard to leave for so long was the guilt. Every conversation ended with me questioning myself, wondering if maybe I really had been too harsh, too demanding, too much. When in reality, all I had ever asked for were the plain, ordinary things one friend asks of another. I eventually stepped back from the friendship, not out of anger but out of sheer emotional fatigue. I was tired of apologizing for things I never did.